Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So this week what I want to talk about is tanking in D&D. I have talked before about different roles in D&D, and I have certainly talked a lot about the role of the controller, specifically with god wizards, but also with other spellcasters as well. But today I want to talk about another role, and the role of tanking. Now, the term tanking really comes from video games, where we have a character that draws enemy attacks. And doing this is usually pretty easy to do because in video games, of course, the enemies are controlled by an artificial intelligence. And because of that, they're predictable. So you can determine exactly what you need to do in order to convince those enemies to attack you and then make your character in such a way that they can take those attacks. And that's pretty simple. In Dungeons and Dragons, it's more complicated. And the reason it's more complicated is because the monsters are not predictable like they are in video games. And that's because we have somebody who is actually controlling those monsters, and that's your dungeon master, and they will use strategy. Depending on the monster, they may determine that a monster is not very intelligent and it's just going to attack whatever's nearest. But a lot of monsters in Dungeons and Dragons are intelligent, or they might just be used to using tactics. And once they do, then it is more difficult to make an effective tank because if you just have a good defense, enemies can just move right around you. So today I want to talk about tanking in D&D, the different ways it can be done, how different classes fit into the role of tanking, and then introduce a character I'll be presenting next week that is a straight tank character. But before I do that, I want to thank some of my patrons. I have a Patreon. The link is in the video description. If you're interested, check that out. Today I want to thank some of my Archmage level patrons, and the ones I want to thank today are Jonathan, John Matera, Sean Bauer, Maximilian Snyder, Cart Mageddon, Kurt G, Tom Owens, and DeCusin. These patrons really help me out, continuing to grow my channel and my content, and I want to thank them so much. So let's talk about tanking. Let's get started. So when we talk about tanking, what we're talking about is a role in combat. So all characters have their own classes, but roles are not official. These are just kind of tactical terms that we use when we're talking about optimization in a way that leads to a party being effective in combat as a team. Now, the role of a tank is to protect the party. A tank character's job is to take enemy attacks and spells. Therefore, when it comes to their defense, there's three things I think a tank needs to consider. The first is, will an attack hit? What's your armor class? The second is, if they hit, do you have the hit points to withstand these attacks? And the third is, can I withstand other effects besides a conventional attack? The third one is the most commonly ignored in my experience, and I've lost track of the number of times I've seen a tank character taken down because of terrible saving throws. Most commonly the wisdom save, which is used for fear and charm effects, both of which absolutely debilitate a tank. Generally, I find that tanks take care of their constitution save, which is also extremely important. A lot of constitution saves, again, can take you right out of the combat. Now, I would say that dexterity is the third most important save in terms of importance, and it's worth noting that a lot of damaging effects that circumvent a good armor class will provide a dexterity saving throw. So really, all three of these saves that come up most commonly end up being pretty important. Regardless of your class, you can only expect to be proficient in one of those saves at character creation unless you are a variant human with the resilient feat. Now, even if you take care of all of that, so you are able to take the enemy attacks, you're able to take the enemy effects because you have good saving throws, you still haven't become an effective tank. The issue with just taking care of your own defense and nothing else is being in front can sometimes draw enemy attacks because it can be inconvenient for an enemy to get around a tank. However, the more resilient the tank, the more likely the enemy will face this inconvenience. Time and time again, I've seen a tank character simply be circumvented by an enemy who then attacks the squishy characters. And generally, the better the tank's armor class, the more likely this is going to happen. Enemies want to hit when they attack, and if they can't get those hits on the tank, they will turn their attention elsewhere if they can. This means there's a fourth thing to consider when making a tank, and that's perhaps the most important of all. How exactly are you going to protect the rest of the party? A character who only defends themselves is not fulfilling the tank role. So when we're talking about defending the party, D&D is a bit more complicated than a video game, but that doesn't mean there's not options. They just require a little bit of research and thought. Easily the most common method I've seen for a tank character to fill the role effectively is by locking enemies down. What this means is that the tank character has a method to restrict or prevent the movement of the enemies. There are a lot of ways to do this. The first, and something any character can at least attempt, is grappling. But a true grapple build will use high athletics to grapple an enemy and keep it in place. Often, a character that is specialized in grapple may have advantage on athletics checks. They may have expertise. The higher that athletics roll, the better chance your grapple will succeed. A grapple can be very effective because an enemy's movement is reduced to 0. There are, however, a few downsides to the grapple method. The first is, the grapple must have a hand free. This prevents using two-handed weapons or a weapon and shield when an opponent is grappled or when you attempt to grapple. The second is, you can only grapple an opponent up to one size larger than you, so there will be certain kinds of enemies that you can't grapple, and if you can't grapple, then you need some other method of tanking, or you are unable to fulfill your role. And the third is, at best, you can hope to grapple 2 opponents, and in most cases, you're probably only going to be grappling 1. The second thing I see used a lot is fear. A tank might use a fear effect, as enemies with the frightened condition cannot move towards the character they're frightened of. In the case of a conquest paladin, they can't move at all if they're within the paladin's aura. This method also has a few downsides. The first is, a number of creatures are immune to fear, and so it doesn't work on them at all. And once again, we end up in the case where if we want to fulfill the role of a tank, we need some other method to fall back on. The second is that fear effects are generally going to provide a saving throw, usually wisdom. But one nice thing about fear is it can often target many enemies. Positioning on the battlefield, however, is important unless you are locking somebody down with a conquest paladin, because a fear effect means that the enemy can't move towards the character they're afraid of, but there may be methods for them to move around that character. So it is important to take a look at the battlefield and how your characters are positioned, so frightened enemies can't just move around the cause of their fear. In addition to grappling and fear, a tank might have other methods to restrict movement, like if they have the sentinel feat and they make an opportunity attack, then that creature's speed is reduced to 0. A number of spells can slow or restrain. Movement can also be forced or restricted with a number of spell effects. These all have certain disadvantages, whether it be saving throws, the requirement of concentration, which can be broken, or proper placement of the tank character. There are a couple other methods of lockdown I've seen as well. One method is just straight out punishment. Sometimes a tank just punishes an enemy who moves to attack other characters, like they use the Booming Blade spell, or the Sentinel feat, or they have damaging barriers like the Bonfire spell, or Cloud of Daggers, or Spike Growth, or certain wall spells. The issue with all of these is, although they improve the damage output of the tank, they don't actually prevent the attacks against the allies unless that punishment drops the enemy. Sometimes, however, if the enemy is aware of these issues, it might be a deterrent to attacking other party members. The final method I see of effectively tanking is to create compelled attacks. Certain effects make it more difficult for an enemy to attack anyone but the tank. The compelled duel spell, for example, or the Cavalier Fighter subclass abilities, or the Ancestral Guardian Barbarian subclass abilities. The compelled duel spell requires concentration and a saving throw, though, and all 3 of these are limited to a single target. So the requirements of being an effective tank are pretty significant. They need a good defense through armor class or hit points or both. They need good saving throws, particularly Constitution and Wisdom, but also Dexterity. They need to be able to somehow make it difficult or to punish enemies who attack other party members, and in some cases doing this reliably can be difficult. So let's talk about the classes and what they bring to the tank role. So the first is the Barbarian, and Barbarians are kind of an obvious fit for the tank, but there are some issues to address. The Barbarian will have the best hit points and resistance to a number of damage types, so often a Barbarian can just take more damage than anybody else. But Barbarians also are often easy to hit, especially if they're using Reckless Attack. And they often have a weak Wisdom save, and beyond grappling, there are not a lot of ways to protect your allies. The exception to this is the Ancestral Guardian Barbarian that has a built-in subclass tanking feature. The next class is the Bard, and Bards generally make poor tanks. They don't have great hit points, or armor class, or wisdom or constitution saving throws. Bard tank is just going to have a hard time surviving. I've seen Bard mixed into multi-class tank builds, especially College of Swords. I've seen quite a bit because they have a method of increasing their armor class when they hit with an attack. But on their own, a Bard is not going to be a very good tank for you. The next is Clerics, and Clerics actually can make an okay tank. They should be able to put together a pretty decent armor class, but their hit points are not going to be great. Spells like Spirit Guardians can help restrict enemy movement, but it doesn't stop movement. A Cleric tank is probably going to need to multi-class or have some additional tricks to be effective. The next is the Druid. Now, any kind of Druid that isn't a Moon Druid is going to be a terrible tank. They're not going to have good hit points or armor class, and they're just going to have trouble with this role. A Moon Druid might be able to fulfill this role to a certain degree at low levels because their wild shapes can provide so many hit points. The issue, again, is that they don't really have a method when they're wild shaped to prevent the enemy from just attacking somebody else. So although they can take a fair bit of damage while they're in their wild shape, they're not protecting the other party members unless somehow they can draw the enemy attacks as well. The next is the Fighter, and this is probably the most iconic tank character. A Fighter can easily put together a good armor class and hit points. Certain subclasses like the Battlemaster have some features to prevent attacks against allies, though they are limited. The Cavalier's Unwavering Mark feature is probably the most obvious way for a Fighter to effectively tank. Otherwise, it is the same issue where how are you going to prevent the enemies from attacking your allies? The most common way that fighters deal with this issue is with feats, because a fighter is going to be getting more ability score increases than any of the other classes, and they can use those on feats that are going to aid their ability to tank, and I will talk more about feats later in this video. The next is the Monk. Now, the Monk is not going to have as high an armor class as a lot of other classes, and they're not going to have great hit points. So you put those two things together, and then the Monk just ends up being too fragile to be an effective tank. Although they do have the ability of Stunning Strike, which could potentially protect allies from an enemy, the personal defense not being good enough is a big problem, and I don't think a Monk is going to operate very well as a tank. The next is the Paladin. Now, Paladins actually may be the easiest to make into effective tanks. You start with a good armor class potential and good hit points. You have proficiency in wisdom saves, and Paladins gain immunity to effects like fear that can cripple a tank. Their protective aura is an amazing feature for a tank, boosting saves of the Paladin and their allies that are nearby. Spells like Compelled Duel or Wrathful Smite can be useful for tanking as well. The Conquest Paladin has a built-in lockdown ability that becomes very effective by level 7. So all in all, Paladin is not hard to make into a pretty good tank. The next class is the Ranger. Now, Ranger is not terrible at tanking, but certainly not exceptional. A Ranger can put together a decent armor class and has good hit points. However, they have neither Wisdom nor Constitution saving throws proficient. A few spells can aid in tanking, such as Spike Growth, Grasping Vine, or Ensnaring Strike, but a number of these spells are not very reliable, and concentration is going to be an issue. So altogether, Rangers can be actually quite difficult to make into effective tanks. If you are considering a Ranger as a tank, it is worthwhile to note that a Gloomstalker Ranger will eventually become proficient in Wisdom saving throws. The next class is the Rogue, and any straight class Rogue just simply lacks the armor class or the hit points. to effectively tank. They get uncanny dodge, but it's not nearly enough to make up for this deficit. Again, unless we're working this into some kind of multi-class, a straight class rogue as a tank is probably a really bad idea. The next class is the sorcerer. And a sorcerer actually can be a very useful part of a multi-class tank because you get access to things like the shield spell, which can be really helpful in boosting the defense of a tank character. But as a single class, this is not a class you want to tank with. Their armor class isn't great, and their hit points are poor. The next class is the warlock. Now, any warlock that isn't a hexblade, you definitely don't want to try to make into a tanking character. Your armor class isn't enough, your hit points aren't enough. You will be going down very quickly. Now, a hexblade could be made to be an all-right tank, but tends to be more effective at doing damage than taking damage. Again, probably useful in a multi-class tank, but on its own it's going to struggle. The next class is the wizard. Now, with more defensive boost options than a sorcerer, a wizard can potentially be a tank, but this requires some careful spell selection and character building, and it really should only be attempted with an abjurer, a blade singer, or a war mage. Again, hit points is going to be an issue, and you are going to have to figure out how to address that. And then the final class is the artificer. And now the most obvious tank option for the artificer is the battlesmith, and that actually can make a pretty good tanking character. It provides additional protection with their steel defender. They can put up a pretty good armor class and can eventually even boost their own saving throws. But they do have a lower hit point total than other martial classes, and that's something you need to consider. So what about feats? Because sometimes feats can help us flesh out a character that maybe has a few gaps, and with a tank we usually have a few gaps we need to fill. And there are a number of feats that can really help with a tank build. The first one I'll mention is Alert. Now, Alert, the bonus to initiative can be important just for positioning, or if you need to set up something like a Rage or like Blade Song. In addition, Alert prevents you from being surprised, and that can be really handy when you're playing a tank character. Another feat that could be useful is Defensive Duelist. Now, Defensive Duelist will allow you to add your proficiency bonus to your armor class as a reaction. The issue with Defensive Duelist, there's actually two. The first is that you need to be using a finesse weapon. But the second, and more important, is that it only affects one attack. So if this is your method of defending yourself, it's not enough. But Defensive Duelist can be part of a concert of things to give you a better defense. The next feat that you might want to consider with a tank character is Dragon Fear. This is a racial feat from Xanathars that's only available to the Dragonborn. Instead of using your breath weapon to do damage, you use it to frighten your enemies. And the DC of this is going to be 8 plus your proficiency bonus plus your charisma modifier. So this is probably only something you want to be making on a charisma build, which you probably are as a Dragonborn anyway. So if you are making something like a Dragonborn Paladin, this would give you another method of creating a fear effect. Now, one feat I want to talk about, but I'm not recommending, is the Grappler feat. The Grappler feat gives you advantage on attack rolls against a creature you're grappling, and you can use your action to try to pin a creature grappled by you. Both these things are not worth taking a feat for. Instead of doing an action to pin a creature grappled by you, you could make a shove attack and knock it prone, and that is going to be just as good as if you had grappled it with a grapple feat. Potentially even better. And the advantage on attack rolls against a creature you're grappling, again, if you shove a creature prone, you will have advantage on those attack rolls. And when you have a creature and you're grappling them, usually you're not going to be the primary source of damage anyway. So neither of these things really make it worth taking the Grappler feat. If you want to be a good grappler, your best methods aren't through this feat. The best methods are to make sure your athletics bonus is as high as possible, and hopefully with advantage as well. The next feat to consider when you're playing a tank character is the Heavy Armor Master feat. Now, this is a feat I think does really well at low levels and not so great at high levels. And the reason is because it creates a static effect where creatures that hit you with non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing attacks, which are fairly common even at high levels, you will reduce that damage by 3. Now, reducing the damage from an attack when you're first level by 3 is a big deal. You might be sitting on anywhere from 10 to 14 hit points. But if you are reducing an attack when you're 20th level by 3, this may be completely inconsequential. So it's something that comes on very strong at level 1, but it recedes rapidly. Something I would consider if I wanted to play a tank in a one-shot that was a low-level adventure. Another way to tank is with the Inspiring Leader feat. And what the Inspiring Leader feat does for you is when you take 10 minutes, you can choose up to 6 creatures, including yourself, and give them temporary hit points. This is a way to shore up your own hit points, as well as protect the rest of the party by shoring up their hit points. You can do this once per rest, whether it's a long rest or a short rest, and this feat tends to work best when you have a charisma character because the amount of temporary hit points you get is increased by your charisma modifier. The next feat a tank might want to consider is Lucky. Lucky is a great feat for a tank because it is going to help your saving throws, and it can also help you when you are targeted with an attack. Lucky can only be used 3 times per day, but it is very easy to use 3 times per day, and getting rerolls on 3 saving throws, if that's all you use it for, is enough reason why you might want to consider the Lucky feat. The next feat you might want to consider is the Resilient feat. And when you consider the Resilient feat, you want to be looking at your dexterity, your wisdom, and your constitution saving throws, and pick the resilient that's going to shore up the one that's the weakest. Saving throws are a huge part of tanking, so resilient is a really obvious choice for a tank character. One of the most common feats to choose in the role of tanking is the Sentinel feat. The Sentinel feat is a way that a tanking character who has no other method to protect their allies suddenly does. First thing it's going to do is, if a creature is just moving around you to go for your enemies, when you make an opportunity attack, their speed becomes 0 for the rest of the turn. And that creature will provoke an opportunity attack from you even if they take the disengage action before leaving your reach. And finally, when a creature within 5 feet of you makes an attack against a target other than you, you can use your reaction to make a melee weapon attack against that attacking creature. So it's just a way to punish enemies who attack other party members. The next feat that a tanking character might want to consider is Tough. Tough basically just gives you 2 hit points per level. 2 hit points per level, especially if you are playing a class that's working with a D8 or, God forbid, a D6 hit points, is a huge increase. Now, if you're playing a barbarian with a high constitution score, Tough as a percentage is going to provide a lot less. But if you have that weakness where hit points are not enough, Tough is a good way to improve that, and it scales with your level. Now, if I'm not proficient in constitution saving throws, I would really look at the possibility of either increasing my constitution or getting resilient con instead of Tough, though, because remember, increasing your con also improves your hit points as well as your constitution saving throw. Tough is a good way when you already have those constitution saving throws to get even tougher. Now, depending on your tanking build, there are a lot of other feats you might want to consider. Feats like Warcaster, feats like Polearm Master, it really depends on your build. But the feats I've discussed are the ones that, on their own, have something really to offer to a tanking character. Now, the other thing to remember is that if you're playing a tanking character, you generally want to be able to deliver damage as well. Now, it is maybe not your primary role. This is what we consider the striker character or the glass cannon's role, to do all the damage while the tank character receives all the damage. But generally speaking, tank characters are at least okay at delivering damage as well. So also we might want to consider feats for that. So next week, I'm going to show you my choice for a tank build. This tank build that's coming up is really good at protecting the party, but also pretty good at defending themselves. And despite being primarily a defensive build, their offense is at least good enough that they can exceed the baseline from level 1 through 20. So that's coming next week, and until then I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everyone, and I'll talk to you next week.